Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you about a piece of legislation known as the Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act 2020. A fairly comprehensive piece of legislation that amends two or three current pieces of legislation. It amends the Residential Tenancies Act of 2006. It amends the Housing Services Act of 2010, and it amends the Building Code Act of 1992. It also replaces the Ontario Mortgage and Housing Corporation Act. Now, there's a number of things in this legislation that don't particularly apply to us at this time. For example, it deals with land lease. It deals with mobile home rules. It deals with rent of subsidized housing and rent geared to income. And it deals with housing that's provided by an employer for their employee. But it also deals with some things that are very, very pertinent to us if we are landlords, if we represent landlords, or if we're selling a rental property to somebody who's going to become a landlord. There's changes to the Residential Tenancies Act that really we need to be aware of. The first thing I want to talk to you about is in response to COVID-19. You remember there was a period of time during COVID-19 when the provincial government stopped you from getting eviction orders. You just couldn't do it. Well, it's back on the table again where you can go to the board and get eviction orders. But if the rent has fallen in arrears after March 17th, 2020, in other words, in response to COVID, then before they're going to issue an eviction order, you've got to show that you tried to negotiate a repayment plan with the tenant. If you haven't done that, then in the hearing, they're going to try and set out a repayment plan that you can work with the tenant to have them catch up on their rent. Now, the positive side of it is if the tenant doesn't follow the plan that's been mutually agreed and put before the board, you don't have to go back to the process again to get an eviction order. It'll be automatic. But you have to give that attempt to try and do it. Now, is that going to be appealed or removed once COVID is completely off the radar? I don't think so. I think it's there to stay. One of the things that is very strong on this new legislation is evicting a tenant of non-cause because you need the unit yourself or the person who's buying the property needs the unit for themselves or their immediate family. The board's going to want to look at whether or not the landlord has done this before. In other words, and we've all run into this, where the landlord has taken a property, moved their son or daughter in for a year, then moved them out into another unit, and unit by unit, they've done this to be able to get them rent up to market rent. The board's going to want to know this. You have to file an affidavit at the same time you make application to the board for eviction for personal use. And if the board sees this as a ploy to try and raise the rent, you're not going to get the eviction order. So they're going to take a look at this and find out if that's something that you've been doing or not. The other thing I want to talk to you about is compensating a tenant for no-fault eviction. In other words, they're being evicted because you knew the unit itself. You have automatically now have to give them 1 month's rent or provide them with another unit that's acceptable to them. So that is automatic by way of compensation. Also, I want to talk to you about bad faith evictions. Or if you're renovating the unit, changing use of the unit, and you evicting the tenant because you need it vacant to do these things, you have to give the tenant the right to move back in at the same rent they were paying before. Now, if you didn't do that, then you will be responsible to pay the rate differential between market rent and the original rent to that tenant for a period of 2 years. And I think the 2 years is really, really important. See, as it is right now, the rule of thumb we go by is if somebody needs the property for their own use, they need it for a year because the tenant has up to 1 year to appeal. Well, that's been changed now to 2 years. So the tenant can come back anytime in a 2-year period and say, I think that the landlord did this in bad faith. I don't think they really needed the unit. I think it was a ploy to be able to raise the rent. And the landlord is going to be on the hook for a period of 2 years, not 1 year. Also, in addition to the rent you have to pay differential, that ceiling on that is $35,000. So that's pretty expensive to the landlord. Now, it may be if the landlord can get away with a minimum of 2 years differential, and whether they can move the same tenant back in at that differential and get away with it or not, I don't know. Sometimes the difference in rent at the end of 2 years, they may be better off to do it, but it's something they've got to take a good hard look at it. One of the other provisions of this new legislation is it makes it easier for investigators to get a court ruling to get access to the landlord's financial records. So, what has he been charging historically in terms of rent? How much money did he spend on renovation and repairs? And so on. They can get this now much, much easier through a court order than they could before. They've also beefed things up a little bit. The maximum fine for an individual for breach under the Act used to be $25,000, now it's $50,000. And if you happen to own this in a corporation, the maximum used to be $100,000, the maximum now is $250,000. Well, it's all gloom and doom, I suppose, except that there are a couple of positive things in this legislation. One is you no longer have to tell a tenant how old the fridge is in the unit, so chalk that up as a positive. Also, as you know, 3 or 4 years ago, the government introduced a mandatory lease form that you had to use. Now there's a little bit more of an extended grace period if you happen to have inadvertently used an older form lease. So those are a couple of changes. Now you need to be familiar with this legislation because it will impact. I think I've covered some of the highlights. Got to be very, very careful when you're evicting a tenant because you need it yourself. And that's why the Ontario Real Estate Association clause when you put in where you're going to be giving an eviction notice on behalf of a beneficial owner who's taking over the property, they want an indemnification because it can be very costly if they're not doing it in good faith and the tenant comes back. So take a look at this legislation. Be aware of it. Thank you very much for taking time to watch this video, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.